Welcome to this UKLFI webinar on Israel's border with Lebanon. We are gathering at an uncertain time to discuss a fast developing situation where the terrorist organization Hezbollah is deeply entrenched in the disintegrating state of Lebanon. UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which intended to resolve the 2006 Lebanon War, established the United Nations force, UNIFIL, in order to monitor the border between Lebanon and Israel. I'm delighted to be joined by leading experts on Resolution 1701 and the security situation on Israel's northern border to discuss the challenges facing the IDF and Israel's government and the interplay of security, international law, and diplomatic considerations. Ambassador Daniel Carmon served as the ambassador and deputy permanent representative at Israel's mission to the United Nations in New York from 2005 to 2010. He played a major role in the negotiations that resulted in Resolution 1701. He'd previously been embassy attaché in Washington, D.C., and was a member of the Israeli delegation to the Camp David peace talks in 1978. Dr. Tal Becker is the legal advisor of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a veteran member of successive Israeli peace negotiations. He's had decades of experience on the front lines of many of Israel's most pressing diplomatic, legal, and policy challenges, and was a key behind-the-scenes representative for Israel in negotiating and drafting Resolution 1701. He's also recently played an instrumental role in concluding the historic peace and normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Dr. Becker is also currently Israel's candidate for the UN International Law Commission, and his book, Terrorism and the State, was awarded the Rabin Peace Prize in 2007, also the Guggenheim Prize for Best International Law Book. And Lieutenant Colonel Sarit Zehavi is the founder and CEO of Alma Research and Education Center. She served for 15 years in the IDF Intelligence Corps, initially in research and analysis, and later on with the Northern Command, including during the Second Lebanon War. Lieutenant Colonel Zehavi has briefed members of Congress in Washington, D.C., advising them on security developments in Lebanon and Syria, and is recognized worldwide as an expert, authority, and speaker on the security issues facing Israel today. Now, could I encourage everyone, please, to put your questions into the Q&A section for the discussion after some opening remarks from our speakers. And it is with great pleasure that I invite Ambassador Carmon to begin by setting out a summary of the background to Resolution 1701 in the 2006 Lebanon War and how it was negotiated. Ambassador.
Thank you very much and good evening. It's a great pleasure to take part in this interesting, fascinating, I'm sure, webinar. I'd like to add to my curriculum 2 points which attach me to Lebanon in one way or another. As a young soldier, a 19-year-old soldier in the 1970, I served during more than 10 days during one of Israel's operations in what was called Fatah land, in a region that became famous much later and still an unresolved region, which is opposite the Shaba farms. And in 1983, I was the IDF spokesman as a reservist, the IDF spokesman in Beirut in what was called the First Lebanon War. I'm not very unique in this. I think that every Israeli diplomat, one way or the other, is attached and has something to do with the long, unresolved, problematic, complex issues that surround Israel and Lebanon, and the southern Lebanese area, the Lebanese border, which is up to now governed by the armistice agreements that date back to the late 40s. But we are talking about 2006 on the background of decades of problems that started in the 70s and even maybe before that. And in 2006, after a very long period of tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, which actually conquered, I have no other word to say, conquered much of Lebanon and especially southern Lebanon. 2006, after a period of few weeks of immense tension, 12th of July, an attack, a cross-border attack by Hezbollah, killed what we thought at the time that they were kidnapped, but they were killed and brought to the Hezbollah, to Lebanon. And Israel decided to launch a campaign, which was called the Second Lebanese War. Some call it Israel-Hezbollah War, a war that started on the 12th of July, ended the mid-August. For me personally, at the United Nations, as Ambassador Deputy Permanent Representative in our mission in New York, I would say in retrospective, the war started on the 11th of July, one day before the actual hostilities and the campaign started on the ground. On the 11th of July, I hosted for lunch in New York a British diplomat called Michael Williams. I'm sure you all heard of him. He was then the head of the Department for Political Affairs at the United Nations, a personal friend of many of us, very knowledgeable and dedicated diplomat. And much of the conversation during this lunch was about Lebanon. And I described the tension that we feel in the area. I asked him quite a lot of questions about how the UN can be more helpful than it is, if it is at all. Just to remind you that we were in a different era. We were under the resolution that mandated UNIFIL 1, which was a small, weak, ineffective interim force, as it was called then. And he gave me UN answers, very straightforward UN answers, that if I go back to that time, and if I'm trying to translate what he told me then and give the same answers today, many of the answers that he gave me then were answers that can be, cut and paste to nowadays, despite the fact that after the war, mid-August, a more robust, strong, what seems to be a comprehensive resolution 1701 was adopted. So not only did, in retrospective, the war start for me in this conversation with a very important and knowledgeable UN diplomat, I think that not too much has changed. This is on one side of the equation. On the other side of the equation, you cannot by no means compare the situation of the engagement of the international community before and the engagement of the international community after. And maybe I'd like, just with very short points, describe to you the process that took place in New York, starting July 12, ending August 13 or 14. depends how you count it, where the Security Council went into engagement, part of it as what I would call standard operating procedure by the international community every time that there are hostilities on the ground. And with one trend, one process, which was the process of trying to bring as soon as possible an end to the hostilities, which was the, I would say, the Lebanese interest. And on the other hand, which I would call an immediate ceasefire, or the urge to do an immediate ceasefire. On the other hand, another trend which was to bring into a comprehensive, sustainable ceasefire, which was the interest of some in the international community, and I would say definitely the interest of Israel, not only to stop the campaign or the war, the Second Lebanese War, but also to put conditions that would allow, that would change the situation, that would take foreign forces out of Lebanon, that would bring finally to the implementation of previous Security Council resolutions regarding South Lebanon, that would make sure that Lebanon exerts its sovereignty over its own territory, conditions that would make more not only military imposition of end of hostilities, but also would bring some political background that would ensure that a change in the situation in the region. I will not go into, maybe we'll go later into some detail, and I'm sure that Dr. Becker will elaborate maybe on the elements of the resolutions, which I'll be glad to do also. But I'd like to put one thing into perspective, which is the role of the Security Council. Many have, in Israel also, the idea that the Security Council is a body that brings, or the international community as a whole, or the UN as a whole, a body that can broker peace. And I'd like to just to make sure that it's understood that the Security Council, from our perspective, is a body that signs to an agreement or to agreements that are decided upon outside of the room, outside of the chambers of the United Nations. And this is a very important distinction, because people expect, because it's an important body, because it is a responsible body, because there are very important and positive participants in the negotiations within the international community and within the Security Council. Many expect, I would say, too much of the Security Council and think that the Security Council can make the decision themselves. What history has shown is that from our interest and our perspective is to have decisions and negotiations made outside the hall, bringing to the hall the agreements for the international community to adhere to them. And this is exactly what happened during this very complicated month of negotiations, where on the one hand, the campaign from our perspective, I'm talking of course from the Israeli perspective, from the one hand, on the one hand, the military campaign went on with the military aims, and on the other hand, diplomacy did its job from, again, our perspective, to give the backing and the envelope to our military to do its job, to take all the negative things that were happening in South Lebanon at the time. I think I'll stop here.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, very much indeed for starting things off for us. Dr. Becker, could you please take us through the content of Resolution 1701 and anything you are able to say as to the negotiation and drafting of the resolution?
Thank
Wonderful.
you. Thank you, Natasha. It's a pleasure to be with you and a pleasure to share the panel with Danny and Sarit. At the time of the Second Lebanon War, I was a policy advisor to Tzipi Livni, the foreign minister. Having spent quite a lot of time on Lebanese and UN issues. And actually on the second evening of the war, I was asked to draft the elements of a resolution that we would hope would end that conflict. And after a very long and torturous and difficult negotiation process, which I can't explain in 10 minutes, but it was a very difficult and contentious process, that resolution that was drafted eventually made its way to become 1701. Perhaps I'll start by saying that UN resolutions, I think it's useful to think of them, first of all, as a kind of literature, and to ask what is the story that they're trying to tell? What is the story they're telling about the conflict? And I think when you look at Resolution 1701, it tells a story about Lebanon, a kind of tragic story that unfortunately has only gotten worse with time. We see today Lebanon facing a terrible catastrophe, but the elements of that catastrophe were well identified both before 1701 and in the resolution itself. Danny touched on a very important point, which was the contest at the beginning of the negotiations was whether the resolution would call for a ceasefire, a kind of immediate ceasefire, or what was called at the time a sustainable ceasefire, meaning looking at the causes of what led to the conflict, what led to Hezbollah's attack. And the resolution itself kind of says this clearly in paragraph 3 of the preamble. It says, not only emphasizing the need for an end to violence, but also the need to urgently address the causes of the crisis. And by doing so, it kind of sets the stage to talk about the different components of the crisis. Before going into the elements of the resolution, I'll just say something about its legal status. There's a common way of thinking about UN resolutions that what matters is whether they're what's called Chapter 6 resolutions or Chapter 7 resolutions. In other words, whether they're adopted under a paragraph of the Charter or a section of the UN Charter dealing with peacekeeping or dealing with what's called enforcement. In practice, however, what really matters is the way in which a resolution is drafted. If the resolution identifies a situation as a threat to international peace and security, uses the language that suggests that it's binding, such as the word decides, shall, authorizes, that means that elements of the resolution, sometimes the resolution as a whole, is binding. And so when you look at 1701, you see in specific areas, particularly when it comes to, as far as Israel is concerned, the role that UNIFIL needs to play, the obligations on different states with respect to certainly the supply of weapons to Lebanon and so on, the resolution includes binding legal elements. So I mentioned a resolution is a story. What is the story that 1701 tells? And one of the ways to understand that is what is the goal? What is the end state, the aspiration of 1701? What did it try to achieve? And it says it very clearly in its provisions. It would like to see the extension of control of the government of Lebanon over all of Lebanese territory, that it should have full sovereignty, that there should be no weapons without the consent of the government of Lebanon and no authority other than the government of Lebanon. And you can see obviously in the subtext of that, the core problem of Lebanon, which is a country that's been taken hostage essentially by a terrorist organization that is funded, armed, directed by a foreign state being Iran. The end state also imagines respect for the blue line, which is the line of withdrawal from which Israel withdrew from Lebanon in the year 2000, which has regularly been crossed, unfortunately, by different Lebanese actors. It specifically focuses on southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah was concentrated at the time, and seeks to establish there a zone free of any unauthorized armed personnel, assets, and weapons. And it also imagines the disarmament of all armed groups, having no foreign forces in Lebanon, no arms without the consent of the government, and no supply of arms or training without the consent of the government. And finally, it imagines a Lebanon that is kind of independent with territorial integrity and borders that are defined. Many people don't know that Lebanon and Syria still have not delineated the border between them. And that's one of the things that enables the kind of free flow of arms between Syria and Lebanon. Those are the kind of big aspirations that Resolution 1701 set. And then it set out a number of means to achieve those outcomes. The most important of which was the establishment of a much more significant UN presence, UNIFIL presence, which was at the time was meant to have a maximum of 15,000 troops. Now that's a maximum of 13,000. In practice, I think there are about 10,000. And what's interesting particularly is the language the resolution gives to UNIFIL in its role, particularly in South Lebanon. And I want to read it out because some people are not aware of how much authority UNIFIL has in practice. The resolution in paragraph 12 specifically says that it authorizes UNIFIL to take all necessary action. That word, all necessary action, is a code word meaning the capacity to use force. Yeah, I hear it on the screen now, in areas of deployment as it deems within its capabilities to ensure that its area of operations is not utilized for hostile activity of any kind, and to resist attempts by forceful means to prevent it from discharging its duties. From Israel's perspective, certainly, this resolution gives UNIFIL a legal capacity to ensure that the south of Lebanon is free of any hostile activity, any armed groups, in order to realize that vision of the resolution. There's something called a CONOPS, which is the concept of operations of a force, which also speaks specifically about the UNIFIL's role to deter and prevent all Hezbollah and other armed element activity in that area. So that's one big chunk of 1701. Another chunk is an arms embargo, which required Lebanon to prevent the entry of illicit arms into Lebanon, and actually has a legal obligation on all states, including Syria and Iran, of course, from providing supplying illegal arms or related material into Lebanon itself. So those elements, there were others as well. The Secretary General is asked to make specific proposals about how to move towards the disarmament of armed groups in Lebanon. And obviously there are elements that were relevant immediately, the withdrawal of Israeli troops, humanitarian assistance, and so on. Those are the elements of the resolution. And I think I want to just make three very, very short points about the takeaways about the reality we face today. I think, first of all, 1701 tells a tragic story of a country that essentially a terrorist organization directed by Iran has taken control of. And we see the catastrophe of non-governments in Lebanon is so acute today, but the problems identified in 1701 of the lack of governance, the control by Hezbollah and armed elements of what happens in Lebanon, those elements continue to be a tragedy first and foremost for the Lebanese people, let alone a threat to Israel. The second point to make is that a UN resolution can create a normative framework. It can create the authority to act, but it doesn't create the will to act. And the will to actually enforce the resolution, there are lots of places to direct that will. We have to look to the Lebanese government, to the Lebanese armed forces, obviously to Syria and Iran and their role over the years in destabilizing and destroying Lebanon, to Hezbollah itself, of course, and to a certain extent to the Security Council for not demanding more of UNIFIL and of Lebanon in living up to the responsibilities set out for them. The final thing I wanted to say is that I think it's really important to understand Israel's actions with respect to Lebanon, its sense of threat from the perspective of the failure of 1701. Israel's view of the situation in Lebanon is best reflected by the gap, I would say the chasm, between the reality 1701 sets out to achieve and the actual reality, the sad reality that exists on the ground in Lebanon. Thank you.
Dr. Becker, thank you very much indeed for that comprehensive overview. Lieutenant Colonel Zehavi, you are monitoring security developments constantly. Could you update us on the current position in South Lebanon and along the border with Israel?
Well, thank you very much, Natasha, for having me. It's an honor to be here with the Ambassador Carmon and Dr. Tal Becker. I just want to take it from the last sentence of Tal Becker that said that it's different realities. There are two different realities. And when I was preparing to this webinar today, I was trying to map the clashes between UNIFIL and Hezbollah in the past year. And I felt as if nothing changed in the past 15 years that I've been following what is happening in South Lebanon. The same reports, by the way, always solely in Lebanese media, sometimes reported in UN reports, but never in the UNIFIL website. The reports are all about entering of UNIFIL forces to areas that it is not supposed to be in, though many of these areas are inside UNIFIL area of operation, which is in blue in my map. Agriculture areas, areas that like the Lebanese army didn't authorize UNIFIL to enter, or the patrol of UNIFIL was not coordinated, or UNIFIL shouldn't get in. And eventually each of these clashes between Hezbollah and UNIFIL, clashes that sometimes end with blocking on the roads, sometimes end with taking UNIFIL's equipment, cameras, and sometimes even more than that. And in a minute, I'll show you some of these. They're all being solved by the interference of the Lebanese army intelligence that comes and solve the clash, but eventually not always give back UNIFIL its equipment that was taken by Hezbollah. As you can see in my map, UNIFIL didn't fail to prevent rocket launching to Israel from its own area of operation, failed to prevent the strengthening of Hezbollah, which in a minute I'll share with you what exactly is happening there. And of course, failed to prevent the digging of tunnels, which in a minute I'll show you. In the recent report that is now going to be discussed in the UN, they are going to renew the resolution. They are renewing the mandate of UNIFIL every year, and we are now facing next week the renewal of the mandate. So there are like UN reports every few months. So it is always described as resistance of citizens that are angry on UNIFIL, that entered to places like that it shouldn't enter, citizens that didn't let UNIFIL to put cameras, though there was a speaking on putting cameras in South Lebanon as part of strengthening UNIFIL mandate, but eventually it didn't happen. No clear answers to whether UNIFIL actually visited the areas of violations, such as the rocket launching areas, anti-tank launching areas, tunnels openings, etc. It's been 15 years since 1701, and the question is what Hezbollah has done since then, and quite a lot actually. What I'm showing you now is a map of all of Lebanon, but you can see again the blue area below, next to the border between Israel and Lebanon. You can see this is the border between Israel and Lebanon. By the way, I'm here, only a few kilometers from the border. This area is by Hezbollah perceived as the first line of defense, meaning that this is the equipment that is based there. And you can see anti-tank missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, and I can say that Cornet here from the anti-tank and the Grads from the surface-to-surface were already launched to Israel more than once in the past 15 years. The ranges of these missiles are clear. These are the ranges. Most of the missiles that are hidden in South Lebanon in the UN area of operation, about 50,000 rockets in the UN area of operation, UNIFIL area of operation, are to up to 100 kilometers, probably will threaten Haifa. Haifa is only about 40 kilometers. from the Israeli-Lebanese border. How does that look like from the Lebanese side? This is a Cornet launching to Israel from South Lebanon, from the UN area of operation, from an area that can see, this is the road that I am driving on almost every day. And this is a Cornet launching by Hezbollah towards the IDF military vehicle 2 years ago. Luckily, though what you see in the video, it looks like it hit, but actually it missed and nobody was hurt. Imagine what would have happened if it wouldn't miss. In a minute, you'll see the explosion. This is it. I'm going to show you just some examples to Hezbollah presence in South Lebanon. Another example is this. This is the tunnels that were found 2 years ago. 6 tunnels, 6 border crossing tunnels were found by the IDF in 2 places, in 2 areas along the borderline. The openings of these tunnels are in Shiite villages in South Lebanon, again, in UNIFIL area of operation. The person that you see now walking inside the tunnel is a Hezbollah operative. He is walking below Israeli land, and he was filmed by IDF camera that was penetrated into the tunnel without knowing that. And it made a small explosion just to intimidate him, and he ran away. 1 tunnel out of 6, again, just an example to what Hezbollah is doing. Another example is the really public presence. You know, after the war, we hardly saw presence of Hezbollah publicly on the border. They you know, put a lot of efforts to cover their military activity, but in the past few years, they are no longer putting efforts to cover their activity. These are Hezbollah dressed in uniforms. This is Hezbollah's flags in yellow here, and on the right side is the Palestinian flag. They made a ceremony. This is a few months ago during the Guardian of the Wall, and they are standing about 1 kilometer from the Israeli-Lebanese border, looking at Israel, making sure that we can see them, intimidating us. I want to show you another example of that I myself took on the border just a few months ago. I was standing on the border looking at Hezbollah yellow flag, and then I see Hezbollah operative coming next to the flag and taking a picture of me, actually gathering intelligence. This is the first time it happened personally to me, but of course not the first time this is happening. The next time I didn't have a very good camera, it happened again. But the next time it happened that Hezbollah operative was accompanied by a Lebanese army soldier. So again, just some examples. The final example I want to show you is how Hezbollah intimidates UNIFIL itself. This is 2 years ago. Hezbollah operatives stopped UNIFIL vehicles, attacked them, stole their weapon, burned the vehicles. I'm moving forward. UNIFIL were in great threat and in great stress. And you can see here the vehicle is burning. UNIFIL soldiers are trying to run away. Bottom line, it's about 50,000 rockets that are hidden inside the towns, making the Lebanese in South Lebanon as human shields that the UN failed to stop, which is of course in oppose to 1701. To my point of view, a UN force, and I think Daniel Carmon also implied to this, a UN force will not defend us Israelis and will not risk itself for us, and I can totally understand. And I think that 1701 meant to create one reality, but a totally different reality was eventually created in South Lebanon. And as far as I'm concerned, it's time to rethink it, and it's time to reconsider it. And maybe to deploy 10,000 soldiers as are deployed today of the UN in South Lebanon, it's not the solution, and maybe it will even interrupt, and they will maybe at risk if there will be an escalation between Israel and Hezbollah in the future.
Lieutenant Colonel Zehavi, thank you so much. We've had questions flooding in, so I'd ask if our panelists could keep their responses as brief as possible, and we'll try and get through as many of them as possible in the hour that we have altogether. Dr. Becker, perhaps I could pick up first on your comments in terms of the context of 1701, a country you said that had been taken over by or taken hostage, in fact, I think were your words, by an organization funded by Iran, and compare it with today. Despite the worsening economic crisis in Lebanon, Hezbollah Secretary General Nasrallah stated on Thursday last week that Hezbollah's top priority is to confront Israel, and he reiterated calls to create a regional equation amid the entire Iran-backed axis of resistance concerning Jerusalem. Of course, that statement comes nearly 2 weeks after Hezbollah fired 19 rockets towards Israel. Would you have any thoughts on how we ought to view this escalation of rhetoric against the background of perhaps Iran's progress on its nuclear capability?
Well, let me say a few things to that. The first is, in the Israeli-Arab conflict, there's a lot of talk about occupation. That language is used a lot, and there's an occupation that often is less spoken about, and that's the occupation of Lebanon by Iran. Essentially, Hezbollah, while it represents or claims to represent the Shia community in Lebanon, its core agenda is representing an Iranian interest, not a Lebanese interest. That's its raison d'etre. And I think the challenge has always been, and I think Hezbollah does have a challenge even today, of legitimacy within Lebanon. And we've seen, particularly following the horrendous port explosion in Beirut, and subsequently with the essential kind of complete downfall of governance in Lebanon and economic struggle, Hezbollah is in a difficult position, but its Iranian agenda still remains very key to how it sees, and Nasrallah certainly sees himself in that way, which is essentially a betrayal of Lebanon. There is no Lebanese interest served by Hezbollah. There is an Iranian interest served by Hezbollah. And Sarit didn't mention this, but it's part of the idea. There is now the major agenda of Iran is to provide Hezbollah with precision-guided missiles that will create a devastating reality if there is ever another conflict. Israel, of course, will do everything it can, not just to defend its citizens, but to deter such an attack. But you ask yourself, what Lebanese interest is served by that agenda? You can even ask a harder question. What exactly is the conflict between Lebanon and Israel? Is there a conflict? The only conflict is Iran's agenda. Otherwise, there wouldn't be one.
Well, Ambassador, following on from that, and of course, we've also seen recent oil shipments that Hassan Nasrallah has referenced, a very open, very public Iranian support for the terror organization. How do you, Ambassador, see the international community responding to that escalating situation? I'm afraid you're still on mute. There we are.
I'd like to point out the fact that while the international public, media, and politicians focus a lot, and rightly so, on the Iranian nuclear development and the Iranian, the nuclear agreement, I think we are not ignoring, but I think that many around the world are ignoring the fact that Iran continues its destabilizing activity across our region. While we, of course, see the threat by Iran on our borders, and not only on the Lebanese border, we've seen a lot of activity by Iran from the Syrian side to the Iranians are very active in continuing to promote terrorism not only around Israel, but also around the other parts of the world. And I think that the world should be more aware of the activities of Iran beyond our close region.
Sarit, we had, of course, the anniversary this month of the Beirut port blast, which Tal mentioned on the 4th of August 2020, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history that pulverized the port and damaged over the half of the city. It's perhaps clear from that, if nothing else, that Hezbollah, like Hamas, has a complete disregard for civilian safety. Does this impact on how you would see a future conflict there panning out?
What, the explosion itself?
And the fact that the ammonium nitrate was stored in that particular context.
We were not surprised, you know, for us, this is Hezbollah's methodology, as you said, also as Hamas, to use the population as human shield. Actually, in Alma Center, we invested a lot of efforts to research that, the human shield tactic, and we traced more than 30 missile sites inside Beirut that can endanger Beirut the same way that the blast, the materials of ammonium nitrate endangered Beirut, because we had found only 30 sites, but there are probably many, many more, because Hezbollah is hiding its thousands of missiles inside the homes or under the homes deliberately in areas that are very crowded to make the Lebanese human shields. One example that we have found in South Lebanon, actually, in a town named El-Kana, there was an explosion of a weapon depot in the town and in one of the neighborhoods. And we succeeded in proving that this weapon depot was a weapon depot of Hezbollah, while Hezbollah tried to present this as the weapon depot of all the munition of an association that its mission is to disarm and find mines in South Lebanon, which is, of course, if there is the human shield, so this is like the social shield, okay? They are building associations that are actually covering their military activity.
Well, I'm sure also many in our audience will recall reports of the United Kingdom having foiled a 2015 Hezbollah terror plot in London, thanks to Israeli intelligence, and therefore be under no illusions about the organization we're dealing with. We've got a few questions from the audience asking, in light of that and the nature of Hezbollah, whether the United States should still be giving aid to the Lebanese army as Hezbollah is entrenched within it, and whether there can in fact be a different strategy for UNIFIL, and what might be done to impact the US's approach to funding the Lebanese army. Danny, do you have any immediate thoughts about?
I would ideally make a difference. And again, I'm talking about something which is an ideal that might not be attained, but I would make a difference between, as much as I can, between the state called Lebanon and its ingredient within the ingredient of the government, which is Hezbollah. It's something that is very difficult to do nowadays. We know that Hezbollah is very much entrenched into Lebanese politics, but if a possibility arises, and if it's possible to do that, I would make the distinction. And I think that history has shown that both France and the US, when they were proactive, they did the right thing in helping humanitarian and militarily the state of Lebanon. I'm not sure it's something that is immediately relevant, but as an ideal, I would do that and take the southern Lebanese issue apart. But I would definitely try to make an effort on the state of Lebanon side to assist Lebanon first and foremost economically, because what is happening there nowadays is really a tragic disaster.
Well, staying perhaps on that theme in terms of what is to be done, one of the questions asks, given Lebanon's totally confusing and dire political situation and the position of Hezbollah with respect to Israel, which is sadly now dominant in that area, with whom can and does Israel meaningfully conduct high-level talks with within whatever is left of the functioning government. Tal, you've been involved in the diplomatic side of things for many a year. Do you have any thoughts on who there is to speak with?
Yes, well, I often say that in the Middle East, we have one resource more than oil, and that's bad options. That's our most abundant resource. And when it comes to Lebanon and the tragedy of Lebanon, to be honest, the first people we rely on is ourselves, because of both of the dynamics that Sarit and Danny described, and the difficulty of genuine commitment from the international community with respect to this situation. There are actors that are important, that do play a role. Obviously, the United States, France as well, given its historic role in Lebanon. There are other countries who certainly care about Lebanon's economic welfare and stability. Members of the Security Council at given times are important interlocutors. Russia, because of its role in Syria, as well as its role in the Security Council as a relevant actor. And UNIFIL does play a role. We obviously feel that there's a massive gap between what UNIFIL could do and what it does do, but we nevertheless see UNIFIL as playing some kind of role, some kind of perhaps assistance in trying to stabilize the situation. Natasha, with your perspective, with your permission, I'll add just one other point. Lebanon historically, famously, is a society of different tribes, of different groups. It was always used in the Middle East as the example of a country that didn't ever really unify. And what was amazing, I think, in the last couple of years is that I think that both the corruption and governance problems within Lebanon and the kind of rotting from within of Lebanon that Hezbollah has caused has triggered a kind of, or signs of a kind of unity across Lebanese identity against this kind of destruction in Lebanon and lack of governance. So, I mean, this is kind of wishful thinking, but I do want to say, not only does Israel not have a conflict with the Lebanese people and hopes to see one day a functioning Lebanese government that would, be able to be sovereign and responsible for preventing terrorism from its territory, one of the most basic obligations in international law. But also perhaps the Lebanese people themselves are a kind of interlocutor for the Israeli people because we have no conflict with them.
I perhaps want to come back to the Lebanese people because we've had a few questions on that. But before, just to pick up, Sarit, on the role of UNIFIL and to pose a couple of additional questions to you, would you say that UNIFIL has in fact enabled Hezbollah to operate with impunity? And the questioner continues, does UNIFIL's presence inhibit Israel from taking proactive action along the border? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, to your first question, it's not that UNIFIL enabled Hezbollah. Hezbollah doesn't need UNIFIL to enable it. Hezbollah is the local power in the region, and it doesn't need a permission from UNIFIL to operate. Of course, that when it was much more difficult for Hezbollah, for example, to operate in open areas, so because of UNIFIL's patrols over there, Hezbollah moved most of its military assets into the towns and villages where over there UNIFIL do not enter. To your second question, remind me the second question about UNIFIL.
It's whether or not UNIFIL's presence really inhibits Israel from taking proactive action.
I don't think that this is the case in routine. In situation of escalation, I think that over here there is kind of a balance of deterrent between Israel and Hezbollah. We all understand that escalation into war may be dangerous for both sides, and that's why we are very cautious in this. Yet, if we will deteriorate into war, definitely the presence of 10,000 UN soldiers at the war zone will interrupt Israeli army, and the Hezbollah will do everything it can to use these UN soldiers as human shields, the same as they are using the Lebanese. I just want to note something about the Lebanese army that was discussed here by Ambassador Carmon. In my point of view, the Lebanese army is not an alternative to Hezbollah, and the issue of assistance to the Lebanese army should continue but it should be very conditional and limited. And the only reason it should be continued is because if United States will not continue the assistance to the Lebanese army, somebody else will. And it may be Iran or Russia or China. And I would prefer that it would be United States. And that's why I think that it should continue, but in a very limited and conditional and exclusive way, of course.
All right, Tal, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about the Lebanese people together, because I'm not sure if you'll be in the best position to answer all of them. But the first is, what is the current general feeling of the Lebanese people towards Hezbollah? Do they consider them responsible for the country's crisis or not? Is there a risk of renewed internal conflict between various Lebanese factions? And the questioner says, hi, I'm French Lebanese, a French Lebanese citizen, a permanent resident in London. What are the actions that Lebanese citizens need to take in order to advance the peace process? So anything you're able to suggest on the basis of those would be very welcome.
Well, I'll first be a little kind of restricted in my remarks. First of all, because I'm here in my capacity as a legal advisor and less as a student of Lebanon, though Lebanon is a country I've followed for a long time. And I say this merely as an observer and follower of Lebanon. I think what we feel at the moment, I think as Israelis looking at our northern border, is that sense of tragedy we've all spoken about. You see the total economic collapse of Lebanon to the point where it's difficult to get fuel and food. Basic resources are not easily available. And that, you know, I don't know if there are any Lebanese on the call, but I would share with them that for Israel, that is a source of sadness and pain. It is no celebration of any kind with that tragedy. And I do sense over the years an increasing outrage towards Hezbollah and towards the kind of devastation that has been wrought on this beautiful country. And I would say we saw some evidence of that very interestingly just a couple of weeks ago when you had a village in South Lebanon where you saw the footage of Druze villagers essentially assaulting Hezbollah and telling them, don't keep your missiles in our towns, don't endanger us. And I thought that was such a telling moment. I believe it happened on the same day that President Raisi of Iran was inaugurated. And it was this interesting kind of split screen of Lebanon kind of disintegrating on the one hand, and you know, the Iranian leadership being kind of embraced. So what can the Lebanese people do? Frankly, I think for an Israeli to tell the Lebanese people what to do is a little arrogant. We're not in their tragedy. And I think the sadness of the moment is how much power is in the hands of forces that do not have Lebanon's best interests at heart. And I think at the end of the day, that situation is hopefully not sustainable. Israel's first obligation, of course, is to its own citizens and its own security, but it doesn't benefit from a country torn apart and in chaos like Lebanon is today. And we can only hope that at the end of the day, those Lebanese who want to live in peace with Israel in a stable country that isn't a threat to its neighbors, that doesn't use itself as a platform to threaten others, those Lebanese will win the day eventually. And we hope for that future.
A question I'd perhaps pose to everyone, but starting with you, Danny, it reads, to what extent do our panelists believe that Israel may be directly affected by the uncertainties we're watching in Afghanistan, which are likely to embolden Al-Qaeda, ISIS, as well as Hezbollah and other malvolient states? The example given by the questioner is Iran and non-state actors. What's your take on the developing situation in Afghanistan and how it might impact on the border with Lebanon?
Well, I might be a little freer than Tal to talk because I'm a retired diplomat, and I've served also as ambassador to India. So the area is a little more familiar to me, maybe than others, but still, again, another tragedy that is not unfolding. It's in its peak, and it's the eye of the storm is there, and just heard a couple of hours ago about a big explosion outside the airport with casualties, including American casualties. I think the main challenge now of the international community is not so much what will be happening inside Afghanistan, the immediate one, but how to assist from the humanitarian point of view, the danger that face women and children, the aftermath of the takeover by Taliban. Unfortunately, the international community has retreated for its own reasons. The Americans have made their decision, and you can criticize it or you can understand it, but I think that the humane tragedy is there, and I hope that the international community will engage to help as much as possible.
And Sarit, do you want to comment on that and perhaps link it to an additional question, which asks, what are the security risks for Israel on the border of a disintegrating Lebanese state? How does a non-existent government affect the Israeli-Hezbollah deterrence equation?
Yeah. Well, of course, this is a debate among experts whether the dysfunctioning of the government and what is happening inside Lebanon is actually putting restraints on Hezbollah, that is very much busy in the internal issues inside Lebanon, busy in building its image among its opponents. By the way, to the question about the Lebanese society, I think that within the Lebanese society that there are many who oppose Hezbollah and there are many who are for Hezbollah, and the Lebanese are divided into these two groups. And one of the problems is that those who are against Hezbollah are very weak, and many of them are leaving Lebanon. And this is very, very sad sights to see. The risks among the Israeli-Lebanese border is exactly what we have seen 10 days ago when Hezbollah launched 20 rockets to Israel. The decision to launch these rockets was actually from internal reasons, to create an impression that Hezbollah is the one who is still in control in South Lebanon. They failed in this, as Tal talked about what happened there with the Druze population that attacked the launcher and the operatives. But the bottom line is that actually internal issues caused Hezbollah to launch these rockets into Israel. Now imagine if Iron Dome would have missed some of these rockets and Israeli soldiers would have been killed or damaged. In this kind of scenario, we would have been entered into a circle of action, reaction, action, reaction. And this is the main danger of escalation in the Israeli-Lebanese border, that an action-reaction circle with casualties, with a situation that people like me that are living next to the Lebanese border will experience alerts and missiles shooting almost every day, will eventually lead us to all-out war. This is, I think, the most probable scenario that we are discussing these days. And there is an option that this scenario is actually, getting more and more probable due to the fact that, due to the crisis inside Lebanon. But again, it's a question.
In the last couple of minutes that we have together, I know Ambassador Carmon has already addressed potential recommendations for the future. Sarit, do you have any thoughts to add on that? And then perhaps I'll finally come to Tal for any recommendations for the future he might have.
I want to take us back to 1701. And I think that my recommendation, and Tal implied to this, is that it's important to have a UN force on our borders. It can intermediate in local conflicts, and there are many local conflicts between the populations that are living next to the border. But we don't need 10,000 soldiers. That's too much. We can definitely satisfy with less than that. That will continue the mediation, that will continue the trialogue between Israel, Lebanon, and the UN, but they will definitely not solve all of the problems of Lebanon as 1701 maybe wanted to create a new reality this didn't happen. With regard to the humanitarian aid and with regard to Afghanistan, the main message of the United States should be, we will make sure, or the West or Europeans, we should make sure where the humanitarian aid is going, whether it's Afghanistan or Lebanon, doesn't matter, making sure that it's not falling eventually in the hands of Hezbollah or Taliban, and we will continue to fight terror, which is also very important, to make sure that the campaign against global terror is not stopped. And the third one is to strengthen all connections with allies of the West in the Middle East, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, etc. UAE.
Thank you. Tal, you're on mute, but do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, final thoughts, it's hard to answer that question in a very short amount of time. There are immediate things that can still be done. The UNIFIL, the resolution itself is being updated next week, and there are specific actions that UNIFIL can take to improve its monitoring of what happens in Lebanon, its intervention in hostile actions. Sarit mentioned the cameras along the blue line to be able to monitor what happens. And obviously there's the economic and humanitarian tragedy which is relevant. But if you look at the bigger picture relates to Iran and the degree to which Iran continues to be able to essentially use Lebanon as a pawn in its agenda. And if to the extent to which the international community allows that to continue, and to the extent to which it's thought that Israel can be weakened by that and Hezbollah can be strengthened, we will continue to see this problem. The story of 1701 is the story of Hezbollah and Iran devastating a country. And if the world was clearer about articulating that narrative, then the benefits of targeting Israel or threatening Israel from Lebanon would diminish, because the legitimacy of that action would diminish, and the legitimacy of Israel's response, necessary response to that, would increase. And so in a way, framing the Lebanese story correctly and standing by the people of Lebanon against Hezbollah and Iran is one of the ways in which we weaken Hezbollah's grip on that country and Iran's use of that country as an instrument of its regional agenda.
Well, I know I have to let our panelists go, but I am so tremendously grateful for the amazing insights that you've all been able to offer. You've been up close and personal with these issues. Thank you so much to Sarit Zehavi, Lieutenant Colonel, for sharing the link in the chat to Alma. There's a wealth of information on there. Thank you, Ambassador Carmon, Dr. Becker, for joining us, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Shalom.
Shalom.